I remember the exact moment my husband realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. His voice was shaking on the phone. Something I had never heard before in 12 years of marriage. "Olivia, something's wrong," Brian said. "The bank says our accounts are frozen. My cards aren't working. The hotel won't accept them. I don't understand what's happening." Behind him, I could hear the faint noise of a crowded lobby and the distant sound of traffic. Somewhere far away, a woman's voice whispered something urgently to him. I already knew who it was. Natalie. For months, those two had been building a secret life behind my back. A life they believed I would never discover. A life they were so confident about that they had boarded a plane together and flown to Mexico to get married. What Brian didn't know was that I had discovered everything long before that phone call. And instead of screaming, instead of confronting him, instead of begging him to stay, I had quietly activated something he didn't even know existed. So when he finally called me from another country, panicking about money, hotels, and locked accounts, all I did was sit there in my Denver apartment, looking out at the city lights. And I asked him one simple question. "Brian, did you really think everything still belonged to you?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I almost thought the call had dropped. But it hadn't. That was the exact moment my husband realized he had completely underestimated me. And by then, it was far too late. 3 months earlier, my life looked completely normal. I was 32 years old, working as a medical administrator at a large hospital in Denver. My days were filled with schedules, insurance forms, patient coordination, and endless emails from doctors who never seemed to have enough time. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was stable, predictable, organized, and I liked it that way. Our apartment sat on the 15th floor of a building overlooking downtown. Every morning I woke up before sunrise, made coffee, and watched the city slowly come alive through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room. Brian usually left the apartment before I did. He was a mechanical engineer working for a manufacturing company that built industrial equipment. His job involved design projects, factory visits, and occasional travel. At least, that's what he told everyone. From the outside, we looked like a couple who had everything figured out. 2 stable careers, no children yet, enough savings to feel comfortable but still working hard toward a bigger future. Friends used words like solid, reliable, and balanced when they described our marriage. What they didn't know was that I handled almost all of our finances. Not because Brian couldn't, but because he never wanted to. I paid the bills. I tracked the investments. I managed the emergency fund, the retirement accounts, the insurance policies, and the shared savings we had been building since our wedding. Over the years, it simply became my responsibility. Brian trusted me with it. And that trust would eventually become the one thing that saved me. The first time I noticed something changing was small enough that I almost ignored it. Brian started coming home later than usual. At first, it was easy to explain. A project deadline, a late meeting with clients, a design review that ran long. I believed him. Then it started happening more often. His phone was suddenly always face down on the table. He began taking calls in the hallway instead of the living room. Weekend work trips appeared more frequently on his calendar. None of it seemed like proof of anything. Just small pieces of discomfort that slowly built into a quiet sense that something wasn't right. I didn't accuse him. I didn't investigate. At least, not yet. For a while, I convinced myself I was imagining things. But intuition has a strange way of refusing to stay quiet. One evening in late autumn, Brian came home unusually tired. He barely spoke during dinner, scrolling through his phone between bites. "Long day?" I asked. "Yeah," he said without looking up. "Just work stuff." After dinner, he disappeared into the bathroom for a shower. I was clearing the dishes when I noticed his phone light up on the kitchen counter. A notification had appeared on the screen. I wasn't planning to read it. But sometimes life changes because of a single sentence. The message preview was short. Just one line. I booked the tickets. Next week we'll finally be husband and wife. For a moment, My brain refused to process what I was reading. Then I saw the name above the message. Natalie. I didn't know her well, but I recognized the name immediately. She worked as a physical therapist at a clinic near the hospital where I worked. I had seen her once or twice during community health events. Pretty friendly. Younger than me. My hands suddenly felt cold. I stood there staring at the glowing screen while the shower water ran behind the bathroom door. Husband and wife. The words repeated in my mind like an echo. Brian and I were still legally married, which meant one thing. Whatever he and Natalie were planning, they weren't just having an affair. They were planning an entirely new life. And in that moment, standing alone in my quiet kitchen, I understood something very clearly. My husband thought I was the last person who would ever fight back. He was wrong. I didn't confront Brian that night. Instead, I placed his phone back exactly where it had been and finished washing the dishes as if nothing had happened. The water ran over my hands while my mind replayed the message again and again. Next week we'll finally be husband and wife. Behind the bathroom door. The shower continued running. Brian was humming softly, completely unaware that the quiet life he believed he was controlling had just started to collapse. When he walked back into the kitchen 10 minutes later, his hair still damp, he found me sitting at the table with a cup of tea. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. "Of course," I said. And for the first time in our entire marriage, I lied to my husband. The next morning I woke up before Brian. Just like always. The city outside our apartment was still dark, Denver's skyline glowing faintly under the early winter sky. I sat by the window with my coffee, trying to slow the racing thoughts in my mind. Anger never came. What I felt instead was something colder, something quieter. Clarity. By the time Brian walked into the kitchen 20 minutes later, dressed for work and adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, I had already made a decision. I would not confront him. Not yet. "Morning," he said, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. "Morning," I replied. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "I might have to travel next week," he added casually. The words almost made me smile. Next week. So the message was real. "Another work trip?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Yeah," he said, avoiding eye contact. "The company's expanding some equipment lines. There's a supplier meeting outside the country." "Outside the country?" The lie slid smoothly out of his mouth. "Sounds important," I said. He nodded. "It's just a few days." For a moment he looked relieved that I didn't question him further. That was the moment I realized something important. Brian had already decided the version of me he believed existed. The trusting wife. The quiet one. The woman who handled the bills and dinners while he quietly built another life behind her back. He thought I would never see it. And because of that, he wasn't even careful anymore. Later that morning, I drove to the hospital like usual. My job required calm focus. Schedules. Patient flow. Insurance approvals. Administrative problems that doctors didn't have time to solve. Normally, the routine helped me relax. But that day my mind kept returning to the message on Brian's phone. By lunchtime, curiosity finally overcame restraint. I opened my laptop in my office and typed Natalie's name into the clinic's internal directory. Her profile appeared immediately. Natalie Carter, age 30. Physical therapist specializing in rehabilitation programs. Her clinic was only 5 minutes from the hospital where I worked. My stomach tightened slightly. I clicked on the professional photo attached to her profile. She looked exactly how I remembered. Bright smile. Confident posture. The kind of warmth that made patients feel comfortable immediately. The kind of warmth that could easily turn into something else. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. How long had this been happening? Weeks. Months. My phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Brian. "Busy today? Might work late tonight." Of course he would. I closed the laptop slowly. The hospital hallway outside my office buzzed with the normal rhythm of nurses walking past. Distant monitors beeping. Overhead announcements echoing through the building. Life continued exactly the same. Except mine had just split into two different timelines. The one Brian believed I was living, and the one I had just discovered. When I arrived home that evening, Brian wasn't there yet. The apartment felt strangely quiet. I walked through the living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, spaces that suddenly felt different now that I knew the truth. On the dining table sat Brian's laptop. He rarely left it behind. But tonight he must have rushed out quickly. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I opened it. Brian had never hidden the password from me. The screen unlocked instantly. His email inbox appeared. Most of the messages were work-related, just as expected. But it didn't take long to find the one thread that changed everything. The subject line read, "Flight confirmation." My heart slowed as I clicked it open. 2 tickets. Denver to Cancun. Departure. 6 days from now. Passenger 1. Brian Matthews. Passenger 2. Natalie Carter. I stared at the screen, reading the confirmation again. Then I opened the next email in the thread. A hotel reservation. 3 nights at a resort near the beach. Another message below that. A wedding service confirmation. Private ceremony package. Officiant included. My hands rested calmly on the keyboard while the pieces of Brian's plan unfolded in front of me. He hadn't just been having an affair. He had organized an entire secret wedding. In another country, while still legally married to me. For several minutes I sat there in complete silence. The betrayal itself hurt, but what surprised me more was how carefully Brian had planned everything. Flights, hotel, ceremony. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, which meant he believed something else too. He believed I would never stop him. I closed the laptop slowly and pushed it back to the center of the table. Outside the apartment window, the lights of Denver flickered across the darkening sky. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. Calm. Still. Thinking. For months, Brian had been living a double life. But tonight I understood something he didn't. He had spent all that time planning his escape, while I had been quietly controlling the one thing he would eventually need the most. Our money. And for the first time since reading that message on his phone, a small, controlled smile appeared on my face. Brian thought he was leaving me behind. What he didn't realize was that he had just given me the perfect opportunity to make sure he never walked away with everything. I spent the next 2 days pretending nothing had changed. Brian moved around the apartment the same way he always did, checking emails on his phone, rushing out the door in the mornings, occasionally mentioning small details about his work trip the following week. If he noticed anything different about me, he never said it. And that was exactly what I wanted. The less suspicious he felt, the more freely he spoke. Tuesday evening we were sitting on opposite ends of the couch while the television played quietly in the background. Brian had his laptop open, scrolling through engineering diagrams, occasionally typing a message to someone from work. At least that's what he wanted me to believe. "I'll probably be gone 4 days," he said suddenly. I looked up from the book in my hands. 4, maybe 5? He corrected quickly. "Depends how the meetings go." I nodded slowly. "Mexico must have a lot of important suppliers," I said casually. Brian's fingers froze above the keyboard, just for a moment. Then he laughed softly. "Yeah, well, global partnerships and all that." The lie was clumsy, but he recovered quickly. "What about you?" he asked. "You'll be okay here by yourself." I shrugged. "I'm used to it." And that was the truth. Over the years, Brian had spent plenty of nights away on legitimate work trips. I had grown comfortable managing the apartment alone, paying bills, organizing finances, and maintaining the quiet routines that kept our life stable. The only difference now was that I finally understood how much control those routines had given me. Later that night, after Brian went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated the stack of folders I kept for our household finances. Checking accounts, savings accounts, investment portfolios, retirement funds, emergency savings. Every number was organized neatly across spreadsheets I had been maintaining for years. Brian trusted me with everything. Not because he thought about it deeply, but because he never cared enough to manage it himself. Which meant something very important. Every major financial account in our household required my authorization. I opened the joint banking portal and began reviewing the details carefully. The balances were exactly where they should be. The investment accounts were stable. The emergency fund held enough to cover several months of expenses. Everything looked normal. But buried within the legal structure of the account agreements was a clause most people never noticed. I had noticed it years ago. And tonight, for the first time, I read it again very carefully. Financial Protection Review. Under certain legal circumstances, suspected fraud, asset misuse, or marital dispute, either account holder could request a temporary review that restricted access to shared funds until the situation was clarified. It was rarely used. Most people didn't even know it existed. Brian definitely didn't. I leaned back slowly in my chair, thinking, if Brian had simply been cheating, the situation would already be painful enough. But secretly planning a wedding in another country while still married to me crossed into something else entirely. Something with legal consequences. My phone buzzed softly on the table. A new notification. Brian's phone, charging across the room, lit up at the same time. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I realized Brian had fallen asleep in the bedroom. I walked quietly across the living room and glanced at his screen. Another message from Natalie. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The preview was enough. I can't believe this is finally happening. 6 more days. 6 days. That was how long Brian believed he had before his new life officially began. I returned to the kitchen table and sat down again. My hands rested on the laptop keyboard while I considered the next steps carefully. Anger would have made everything messy. Confrontation would have warned him. But patience. Patience could change everything. The next morning, I left work early and drove to a small law office downtown. The building itself was quiet and professional, tucked between 2 glass office towers near the courthouse district. Inside, the receptionist directed me to a conference room. 10 minutes later, a woman in her 40s entered carrying a legal folder. Olivia Matthews, she asked. Yes. She introduced herself as Rebecca Alvarez, a family attorney who specialized in divorce and financial protection cases. I had found her online the night before. What can I help you with? She asked calmly. For a moment, I simply sat there. Saying the words out loud made everything feel more real. My husband, I said slowly, is planning to marry someone else next week. Rebecca's eyebrows lifted slightly. While still legally married to you? Yes. And you have proof? I slid my phone across the table. Screenshots of the flight confirmations, hotel reservations, the wedding service booking. Rebecca studied the images carefully. Then she leaned back in her chair. Well, she said quietly, that certainly changes things. For the next hour, we discussed everything. Our shared assets, joint accounts, property ownership, legal protections. By the time the meeting ended, one thing had become very clear. Brian believed he was leaving our marriage quietly. But legally speaking, he had just given me a powerful advantage. Rebecca closed the folder and looked directly at me. If you want to protect your finances, she said, you should act before he leaves the country. I nodded slowly. I plan to. When I stepped outside the office building, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the windows of downtown Denver. Traffic moved steadily through the streets. People walked past me, living their ordinary lives. And for the first time since discovering Brian's secret, I felt something steady settle inside my chest. Not anger, not sadness. Control. Brian thought he was escaping. But what he didn't realize was that the moment he boarded that plane, he would be stepping directly into the trap I was quietly building for him. The next few days became the strangest performance of my life. Every morning I woke up beside Brian as if nothing had changed. I made coffee. I asked about his day. I listened to his casual stories about work meetings and engineering deadlines, while knowing that he was secretly preparing to marry another woman in less than a week. And the strangest part was how easy it became. Once the truth is revealed, pretending becomes much simpler than people imagine. Thursday evening, Brian came home earlier than usual. He dropped his keys on the counter and stretched his shoulders like someone who had just finished a long day. "Good news," he said. I was chopping vegetables in the kitchen. "Oh." My travel schedule got finalized. I looked up with calm interest. "When do you leave?" "Monday morning." 4 days? He leaned against the counter watching me cook. "It'll probably just be 3 or 4 days," he added. "I'll try not to be gone too long." I nodded. "Take your time," I said. The words surprised him slightly. "You sure?" "Of course," I replied. "Your work is important." For a moment he looked relieved. Brian had expected questions, suspicion, maybe even resistance. Instead, he found the same quiet wife he believed he had always known. The one who trusted him. The one who never looked too closely. That night, while Brian packed a few things into his suitcase, I sat at the dining table with my laptop open. Not to investigate him anymore, but to prepare. My meeting with Rebecca Alvarez earlier that week had clarified everything. Protecting my future wouldn't require revenge or dramatic confrontation. It would require timing. Careful, precise timing. The joint accounts Brian and I shared held nearly all of our financial assets. Savings, investments, emergency reserves. Over the years, we had built a comfortable financial cushion together. Brian had always believed those funds were equally accessible to both of us. Legally speaking, they were. But the financial protection clause Rebecca had explained gave me the ability to temporarily restrict access under very specific circumstances. And planning a secret marriage abroad while still legally married definitely qualified as suspicious financial activity. The key was activating the review at the right moment. Too early, and Brian might notice before leaving the country. Too late, and he could withdraw large amounts of money before I acted. The ideal moment would be after he had already left, when he felt completely secure, when he believed his new life had already begun. Saturday afternoon, I returned to Rebecca's office to finalize the paperwork. She greeted me with a professional smile and handed me several documents. "Once this is submitted," she explained, "the bank will initiate a temporary review of your joint accounts. That usually triggers restricted access until the financial investigation is completed." "How long does that take?" I asked. "It depends," she said. "Sometimes weeks, sometimes months." That was more than enough time. Rebecca studied my expression carefully. "You're handling this very calmly," she said. I folded the document slowly. I had a few days to think. Most people imagine betrayal as something explosive. But the truth is much quieter. The moment you understand someone has been lying to you for months, something inside you simply changes. The love doesn't disappear instantly, but the illusion does. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "Well," she said, "when you're ready, we can activate the request." I slid the documents back across the table. "Not yet." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "When?" I thought about Brian packing his suitcase, about Natalie waiting somewhere, counting down the days. "Monday afternoon," I said. Rebecca understood immediately. "You're waiting until he leaves the country?" "Yes." She gave a small approving nod. "That's strategic." By Sunday night, Brian's excitement had become almost impossible to hide. He kept checking his phone, smiling occasionally at messages he thought I didn't notice. At dinner, he barely touched his food. "You seem distracted," I said gently. "Just thinking about work," he replied quickly. Of course he was. Work. Not beaches in Mexico. Not hotel reservations. Not wedding ceremonies. Work. After dinner, he zipped his suitcase closed and placed it by the door. "Early flight tomorrow," he said. "I'll drive you to the airport," I offered. He hesitated. "You don't have to." "I want to," I said, and I meant it. Monday morning, the Denver airport was busy with the usual rush of travelers. Brian checked his bag while I waited beside him. He looked almost nervous. Excited, but nervous. "Thanks for bringing me," he said. "Of course." For a moment we stood there awkwardly. Then he leaned forward and kissed my cheek. "I'll call when I land." "Safe flight," I said. I watched him walk toward security. He didn't look back. Not once. 2 hours later, I was sitting in my car outside a small coffee shop downtown. My phone buzzed. A message from Brian. "Just boarded." Perfect. I waited another 3 hours. Long enough for his plane to cross the border. Long enough for him to feel completely secure. Then I opened my laptop. The documents Rebecca prepared were already uploaded into the bank's secure portal. All I had to do was confirm the request. My finger hovered above the trackpad for a moment. Not because I doubted the decision, but because I understood what would happen next. Brian believed he was starting a new life that afternoon. Instead, he was about to discover something very different. I clicked submit. The confirmation screen appeared almost immediately. Financial protection review initiated. Joint account access temporarily restricted. Investigation pending. I closed the laptop slowly and took a sip of coffee. Somewhere above the clouds, Brian's plane continued flying south toward Mexico. And he had absolutely no idea that the moment he landed, his entire financial world would already be locked. Brian landed in Mexico just after noon. I knew the exact moment because his message arrived while I was still sitting at the coffee shop downtown. Landed safely. Talk later. I stared at the text for a moment before setting my phone down on the table. Outside the window, people walked past carrying shopping bags, talking on phones, laughing about things that probably felt important to them. The world continued exactly as it always had. But somewhere hundreds of miles away, Brian had just stepped into the most carefully timed mistake of his life. I didn't answer his message. Instead, I drove back to the hospital and finished the rest of my shift like any other Monday. Patient scheduling issues, insurance authorizations, doctors asking for last-minute adjustments to appointment calendars, ordinary problems that required calm. Practical solutions? Strangely enough, focusing on work made everything easier. For months, Brian had been living a secret life while pretending our marriage was still intact. Now the balance had quietly shifted. Except he didn't know it yet. Around 5 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Brian. "Hotel looks amazing." A second message followed almost immediately. "Wish you could see this place." I almost laughed at that. Brian had always believed small lies were harmless if they sounded friendly enough. But I could imagine exactly what was happening on the other side of the phone. Natalie probably standing beside him. The warm air of Cancun. The excitement of believing they had finally escaped the complications of the life they were leaving behind. What neither of them realized was that the complication had already followed them. I left the hospital shortly after 6 and drove home through the early evening traffic. The apartment felt unusually quiet without Brian there. No half-finished coffee mugs. No engineering diagrams scattered across the kitchen counter. Just silence. I changed into comfortable clothes and poured myself a glass of wine before sitting near the window overlooking downtown Denver. The city lights slowly brightened as night settled across the skyline. My laptop rested open on the table beside me. Every so often I refreshed the banking portal. The financial review status remained exactly the same. Active. Access restricted. Everything was working exactly as Rebecca had explained. Around 8 o'clock my phone rang. Brian's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hey," I said calmly. "Olivia?" Brian replied, sounding cheerful. "Sorry I didn't call sooner. The flight was long." "That's okay. You should see this place," he continued. "The resort is incredible." I listened quietly while he described the beach, the view from the hotel, and the warm weather. He spoke easily, comfortably, the same confident voice he always used when he believed he was in control. Then something changed. His words slowed. "Hold on a second," he said suddenly. I heard muffled voices on his end of the line. A distant conversation with someone, probably a receptionist. Then Brian's voice returned. But it sounded slightly different. "Olivia, this is strange." "What is?" I asked. "My card isn't working." I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the Denver skyline. "What do you mean?" I tried to check in at the hotel, he said, but the payment got declined. That's odd. Yeah, he muttered. It must be the bank. Sometimes international transactions trigger security checks. I heard him typing quickly on his phone. Let me try another card, he said. A few seconds passed. Then another pause. Okay, that one didn't work either. I took a slow sip of wine. Maybe call the bank, I suggested. Yeah, I probably will, he replied. It's probably just a security hold. His voice still sounded calm, still confident. But underneath it, I could hear the first hint of confusion. I'll figure it out, he added. I'm sure you will, I said. A few minutes later, the call ended. I placed the phone down and waited. The second call came 20 minutes later. This time, Brian sounded very different. Olivia, he said quickly. Something's wrong. What happened? I called the bank, he said. They said the accounts are under review. My eyes moved slowly toward the laptop screen beside me. The status hadn't changed. Active review. Restricted access. What kind of review? I asked. They wouldn't say, he replied. They just told me the accounts are temporarily locked. I could hear movement around him. Hotel lobby noise. Footsteps. Someone speaking Spanish nearby. I can't access anything. He continued. Savings. Credit cards, even the investment account. His voice was rising now. Confused. Worried. This has to be a mistake. I didn't respond immediately. On the other end of the line, Brian was breathing faster. I tried every card I have, he said. Nothing works. I could hear another voice in the background. Natalie? She whispered something urgently. Brian covered the phone for a moment before speaking again. Olivia, did you move the money? There it was. The first moment of suspicion. The first moment Brian realized the situation might not be random. I looked out at the quiet city lights beyond the window. For months, Brian had been hiding the truth from me, planning his escape, building a future he believed I would never discover. Now he was standing in another country with no access to the life he thought he controlled. And he still didn't understand why. Olivia, he said again, more urgently. I let the silence stretch just a little longer. Then I spoke. Calm. Steady. Controlled. I didn't move anything, I said. Technically, it was true. I hadn't moved the money. I had simply made sure he couldn't touch it. And Brian was about to discover that the situation was far worse than he imagined. Olivia, this doesn't make any sense, Brian said, his voice tight with frustration. I could hear the faint echo of a large room behind him, along with the sound of luggage wheels rolling across marble floors. The hotel lobby must have been crowded. What exactly did the bank say? I asked calmly. They said the accounts are under review, he replied. But they wouldn't explain why. And all the cards stopped working. Yes, every single one. I took another slow sip of wine and glanced at the laptop screen beside me. The financial portal still showed the same notification. Joint accounts under financial protection review. Access temporarily restricted. Everything was working exactly as planned. Brian exhaled sharply on the other end of the phone. This has to be some kind of error, he muttered. I've used those cards internationally before. Did you try calling them again? I asked. I did, he said. They told me someone triggered a review request. For the first time since the call started, his voice carried a hint of suspicion. Do you know anything about that? I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the Denver skyline. No, I said quietly. Another pause. Longer this time. Behind Brian's breathing, I could hear Natalie speaking again. Her voice lower but clearly impatient. Tell her the hotel needs payment now, she whispered. Brian covered the phone briefly. When he returned, his tone had changed. Olivia, I need to fix this tonight. Why tonight? The hotel won't finalize our reservation without a valid card. There it was. Our reservation. Not his. Not a work trip. The word slipped out before he could stop himself. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds. Who's with you? Brian? I asked softly. His breathing stopped. What do you mean? You said our reservation. But another pause. In the background, Natalie stopped talking. Brian cleared his throat. I meant the company reservation, he said quickly. Of course. The lie sounded weaker this time. Brian tried again to regain control of the conversation. I just need you to check something for me, he said. Maybe the bank froze the accounts because of some verification issue. Maybe, can you log in and see if there's a notification? I turned slightly toward the laptop, pretending to check. Oh, I said after a moment. What? There is something. What does it say? I let another small pause settle into the call. It says the accounts are under review for unusual activity. Brian swore quietly. What kind of unusual activity? It doesn't say. That's ridiculous, he snapped. We haven't done anything unusual. I remained silent. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Brian asked the question again. Olivia, are you sure you didn't move any funds? No, I replied calmly. He exhaled sharply again. Okay, he said. Then maybe it's just a security lock. I'll deal with it tomorrow. But his voice no longer sounded confident. Behind him, Natalie spoke again, louder this time. Brian, ask her if she can transfer money to another account. I heard the frustration in her tone. Brian hesitated before repeating the question. Can you transfer some funds to my personal account? Just temporarily. I turned back toward the city lights outside my window. That might not be possible right now. Why not? If the accounts are under review, transfers are probably restricted. He went quiet again. This time the silence carried something heavier. Fear. Okay, Brian said finally. I'll talk to the bank again tomorrow. That's probably the best idea. He hesitated before speaking again. Olivia? Yes. If the accounts really are frozen, we might have a serious problem. Why? The hotel needs payment tonight. I'm sure you'll figure something out. He didn't respond immediately. For the first time in our marriage, Brian sounded uncertain about what to say next. I'll call you tomorrow, he muttered. All right. The call ended a few seconds later. I placed my phone down on the table and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the Denver skyline shimmered under the quiet glow of evening lights. Somewhere far away in Mexico, Brian was standing in a hotel lobby beside the woman he planned to marry, realizing that every financial resource he thought he controlled had suddenly disappeared. I opened the banking portal again and refreshed the page. The review status remained unchanged. Active. Restricted. Protected. My phone buzzed with a new message. This one from Rebecca. The financial review has been fully processed. He will not be able to access any joint assets until the investigation concludes. I typed a short reply. Thank you. Then I closed the laptop and stood up. For months, Brian had been living a secret life while believing I would never notice. Tonight, he was finally discovering what happened when someone underestimated the wrong person. And the truth was, this was only the beginning. The next morning, Brian called again. This time, the moment I answered, I could hear the difference in his voice. He sounded exhausted. Olivia, I barely slept, he said. I was standing in my kitchen pouring coffee while the early morning light spread across the Denver skyline. Why? I asked. The bank still won't release the accounts. His words came out fast. Rushed. Like he had been rehearsing them. I called 3 different departments, he continued. Fraud prevention. Customer support. Even the investment division. And they all say the same thing. The accounts are under legal review. Legal review. The words hung in the air between us. That sounds serious, I said. Yeah. It does, Brian muttered. I heard a chair scrape against the floor on his end of the call. It sounded like he had stepped away from wherever Natalie was. They won't tell me what triggered it, he added. Just that someone requested a financial protection investigation. My fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug. Did they say who requested it? I asked. No, his voice lowered. But it had to be you. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked toward the window and looked down at the quiet morning traffic below. Why would you think that? I asked calmly. Because you're the only other person on the accounts, he said. That's true. So did you? Another silence stretched between us. I could almost feel Brian waiting, trying to read meaning from the pause. I spoke with a lawyer this week, I said finally. His reaction was immediate. You what? A lawyer? Why? I took a slow breath. Because I discovered something interesting on your laptop. The quiet on the line lasted long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. Then he spoke again. What did you see? Your flight confirmation. His breathing became shallow. And the hotel reservation? I continued. Still no response. And the wedding service booking? The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we had ever shared. For 12 years, Brian had always been the confident one in our marriage. The one who assumed he understood every situation. But now he had nothing to say. Finally, he whispered one word. Olivia. Yes. It's not what you think. The sentence sounded painfully familiar. Every story about betrayal seemed to include it. I'm curious, I said quietly. What exactly do you think I believe? That I'm abandoning you, he said quickly. Aren't you? No. Then what are you doing in Mexico with Natalie? Another long pause. I was going to explain everything when I got back, he said. That almost made me laugh. You were going to explain the wedding. It wasn't a real wedding, he insisted. Oh, it was just a symbolic ceremony. Of course. Olivia, please listen, he said urgently. Natalie and I, things just got complicated. Complicated? The word felt strangely small compared to everything that had happened. I see, I said. Look, I know this looks bad, he continued, speaking faster now. But freezing the accounts is extreme. I didn't freeze anything. You triggered the investigation. I protected our assets. That's the same thing. No, I said calmly. It's not. Brian exhaled sharply. You're overreacting. I stared at the skyline for a moment. Am I? Yes. So planning a wedding with another woman while still married to me is normal. That's not what happened. Then explain it. Brian hesitated. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. The confidence was gone. Now he sounded defensive. Olivia, I need access to the accounts. Why? You know why. Tell me. The hotel needs payment. I closed my eyes for a moment. Somewhere on the other end of the line, Natalie was probably listening, waiting, expecting Brian to solve the problem. And after the hotel? I asked. What? After you pay the hotel, what happens next? Brian didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. The ceremony, the beach, the photographs, the life he thought he was starting. Olivia, he said again, his voice almost pleading now. Just unlock the accounts. We can figure everything else out later. I opened my eyes and looked at the quiet city below. For months, Brian had been carefully planning his future. But he had forgotten one small detail. The person controlling the foundation of that future. I can't do that, I said. Why not? Because the investigation has already started. You can cancel it. No. Why not? Because the lawyer advised against it. Brian swore quietly under his breath. Olivia, this is insane. Is it? Yes? I disagree. Another long silence followed. When Brian spoke again, his voice carried something I had never heard from him before. Fear. What am I supposed to do now? He asked. I looked out across the city. The sunlight had finally begun to fill the streets below. You'll have to figure that out, I said softly. And for the first time since this entire situation began, Brian finally understood something. He was no longer the one in control. Brian didn't call again that afternoon. But the messages started arriving. First, it was a short one. Olivia. Please call me. Then another. This situation is getting worse. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I finished my workday at the hospital, drove home through the steady flow of evening traffic, and cooked a simple dinner for myself in the quiet apartment. For years, the place had felt like something Brian and I built together. Now it felt different. Cleaner? Calmi. Like a space that finally belonged to me. While the pasta boiled on the stove, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Brian. The bank says the review might take weeks. I set the phone down without replying. By the time I finished eating, there were 3 more messages waiting. The hotel won't extend the reservation. Natalie is asking questions. Please just talk to me. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. For months, Brian had been living 2 separate lives. Now those lives were colliding, and he had no idea how to stop it. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. Brian. This time I answered. What now? I asked calmly. Everything is falling apart, he said immediately. His voice sounded strained, like he had been arguing with someone. The hotel won't let us stay another night without payment. Then you should probably pay them. I can't, he snapped. You know I can't. I remained silent. Behind him, I could hear Natalie speaking loudly. Tell her this is ridiculous, she said. Brian lowered his voice. She's asking if you're doing this on purpose. That's an interesting question. Olivia, he said, frustrated now. Stop playing games. I'm not playing anything. You froze every account we have. I protected the assets. That's the same thing. No, I said calmly. It isn't, he exhaled sharply. We're stuck here. Brian hesitated. Yes. So Natalie is still there. Another pause. Yes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Brian said something that made the entire situation feel even more fragile. She didn't know about the financial review. That must be awkward. You're enjoying this, aren't you? No. Then why won't you fix it? I stood up and walked toward the balcony window. The night air over Denver was cool, carrying the distant sound of traffic through the streets below. Because this isn't something I broke, I said quietly. Olivia, you broke it. Brian went silent. Then, for the first time since this conversation began days ago, Natalie's voice cut through the call clearly. Brian, give me the phone. A moment later, she was speaking directly to me. Olivia, she said, her tone sharp. Whatever this is, it's gone far enough. I leaned against the railing, watching the city lights stretch across the skyline. Hello, Natalie. This financial stunt of yours isn't going to solve anything, she continued. Financial stunt. You froze the accounts because you're angry. No. Then why? Because I had to, Natalie scoffed. You're ruining 3 lives over jealousy. 3 lives. That almost made me laugh. You're very confident for someone who just arrived in my marriage, I said. I didn't arrive anywhere, she replied. Brian told me everything about your relationship. Did he? Yes. And what exactly did he say? That your marriage was already over. The calm inside me didn't change. That's interesting, I said. Why? Because Brian forgot to mention one small detail. What? That we're still legally married. Natalie didn't respond immediately. Then she said something that revealed more than she probably intended. He told me the divorce was basically done. Really? Yes. I closed my eyes briefly. Brian had been lying to both of us. When I opened them again, the skyline of Denver stretched quietly beneath the dark sky. You should probably talk to Brian about that, I said. Natalie hesitated. Then she handed the phone back. Brian returned to the call, his voice tense. What did you say to her? Nothing she shouldn't already know. Olivia? She believed you were divorced. He didn't respond. That must be a difficult conversation to have, I added softly. On the other end of the line, I heard raised voices. Brian and Natalie arguing quietly but intensely. For several seconds, neither of them spoke to me. Finally, Brian returned. Look, he said, trying to regain control. This situation is getting out of hand. I agree. So unlock the accounts. I can't. You won't? No, I said calmly. I won't. Another silence filled the call. This time it felt heavier. Because Brian finally understood something he had been avoiding. I wasn't going to fix the problem for him. Olivia, he said slowly. Yes. If you don't reverse this, everything could collapse. I looked out across the city lights. That's already happening, I replied. And for the first time since he boarded that plane to Mexico. Brian had no argument left. Brian called again the following evening. This time I could hear chaos behind his voice before he even spoke. Olivia, I need you to listen, he said quickly. I was sitting at my kitchen table finishing a late dinner when the phone rang. Outside the window, Denver's night traffic moved slowly beneath the glow of streetlights. I'm listening, I replied. The hotel locked our room. Our room? Yes, he snapped. Because the payment didn't go through. I leaned back in my chair. That sounds inconvenient. You don't understand, he said, frustration bleeding into every word. They gave us 12 hours to fix the payment. When we couldn't, they canceled the reservation. So where are you staying now? There was a pause. We're not, he admitted. I pictured the scene without needing to see it. Suitcases. Crowded streets. Two people who thought they were starting a romantic escape suddenly realizing they didn't even have a place to sleep. What about another hotel? I asked. I tried, Brian said. Every card gets declined. He sounded exhausted. I even tried withdrawing cash. And same problem. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. So the financial review is still active. Yes, he said bitterly. We've established that. In the background I heard Natalie speaking again. But this time her voice was sharper. Ask her if she's doing this on purpose, she said. Brian sighed heavily. She already knows you're here, he muttered to Natalie. Then he returned to the phone. Natalie thinks you're trying to trap us. I didn't answer immediately. Is she wrong? Brian asked. I glanced at the laptop beside me. The financial portal still showed the same notice. Access restricted. Review ongoing? No, I said finally. So you admit it. I protected what belongs to me. That's not protecting, he snapped. That's punishment. I turned toward the window again. Brian, you planned a wedding in another country while still married to me. That wasn't real. It was real enough to book a ceremony. His breathing became uneven. Olivia, please, he said. I need access to the money. For what? To fix this. What exactly does fixing this look like? He didn't answer. Because the truth was obvious. Fixing it meant finishing the plan he had started. Paying the hotel. Standing on a beach with Natalie. Taking photographs that would erase the life he shared with me. You still want to go through with the ceremony? I said quietly. That's not what I said. But it's what you meant. Another long silence filled the call. Then Brian spoke again. Softer this time. You're destroying everything. No, I replied calmly. I'm protecting it. Behind him, Natalie raised her voice again. Brian, we can't keep doing this. What do you want me to do? He snapped back at her. Figure something out. Their argument carried clearly through the phone. For months they had probably imagined this trip as the beginning of something perfect. Now it sounded like the beginning of the end. Brian returned to the call a moment later. She's leaving, he said quietly. Leaving. She's looking for another hotel. Does she have money? Yes, he admitted. So she'll be fine. That's not the point. What is the point? Brian hesitated. Then he said something that revealed more than he probably intended. She didn't sign up for this. I almost smiled. No, she had signed up for something very different. A romantic escape. A secret wedding. A man who claimed he had everything under control. Instead, she found herself in a foreign country with someone who couldn't even pay for dinner. Olivia, Brian said again, desperation creeping into his voice. Yes. If you don't unlock the accounts, this could ruin my life. I looked down at the phone in my hand. For a moment, I thought about the years we spent building a life together. The savings we accumulated, the future we once planned. Then I remembered the message on his phone. Next week we'll finally be husband and wife. You already did that, I said quietly. What? You ruined it. Brian didn't respond. The silence stretched so long I could hear only the distant sounds of the Mexican street around him. Car horns, footsteps, voices speaking Spanish somewhere nearby. Finally, he spoke again. So that's it, he asked. For now. You're just going to leave me here like this. I stood up and walked slowly toward the balcony window. Yes, I said. And when I get back to Denver, we'll deal with that then. Another long pause filled the call. Then Brian said something that sounded more like realization than anger. You planned this? Yes. You waited until I left the country? Yes. So I couldn't do anything? That's correct. For several seconds, Brian didn't speak. Then he said something quietly. I never thought you'd do something like this. I looked out across the glowing skyline of Denver. That's the problem, I said. And for the first time since everything began, Brian finally understood exactly how badly he had misjudged me. The next morning, Brian didn't call. For the first time since his trip began, my phone remained silent. I noticed it while standing in my kitchen preparing coffee before work. The quiet felt different from the frantic messages and calls that had filled the last few days. It wasn't calm. It was the silence that comes after something finally breaks. I checked my phone once while driving to the hospital. Nothing. No messages. No missed calls. For a moment, I wondered if Brian had finally found a way to fix the financial situation. But I doubted it. Rebecca had made it very clear that the review process was locked in place. Brian couldn't withdraw funds. He couldn't transfer money. He couldn't close the accounts. The system had sealed every exit he might try. By mid-morning, the hospital was already busy. 2 nurses were arguing about a scheduling conflict outside my office. And one of the surgeons had sent 3 emails in less than an hour about a change to next week's operating schedule. The normal chaos of my job pulled my attention away from everything else. For a while, I almost forgot Brian was even in another country, until my phone finally vibrated around noon. A message appeared on the screen. We need to talk. No greeting. No explanation. Just the sentence. I waited nearly an hour before replying. About what? 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Everything. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing again. Call me after 6. The reply came quickly. Okay. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. Not because I was nervous, but because I already knew how the conversation would go. By the time I left the hospital, the sun was beginning to set behind the Denver skyline. Traffic moved steadily through the streets while I drove home. The apartment was still quiet when I walked inside. Brian's suitcase was still gone. The space he normally occupied still empty. I poured myself a glass of water and sat near the window, waiting. At exactly 6:15, my phone rang. Brian, I answered. Hello. He didn't speak immediately. When he finally did, his voice sounded very different from the man who had left Denver earlier that week. Tired. Defeated. Natalie left this morning, he said. I said nothing. She found another hotel, he continued. One she could pay for herself. That makes sense. Another pause. She's been asking a lot of questions. I imagine she has... Brian exhaled slowly. I told her everything. Everything. Yes. That you're still married. Yes. That the money belongs to both of us. Yes. That you were planning to marry her while still legally married to me. His voice tightened. Yes. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. So what happens now? I asked. Brian hesitated. I don't know. That answer alone told me everything I needed to know. For the first time since this entire situation began, Brian had no plan. No control. No confident solution. Just uncertainty. I tried calling the bank again today, he said. And they said the investigation could expand. Expand. Yes. His voice dropped lower. They said there are concerns about attempted financial activity tied to an overseas marriage. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Rebecca had warned me that might happen. If the investigation confirms misuse of shared marital assets, Brian continued, they could keep the accounts restricted until the divorce process begins. The word hung quietly in the air. Divorce. For months, Brian had been preparing to escape our marriage. Now he was finally forced to face the reality of ending it legally. Olivia, he said carefully. Yes. When I come back, we need to talk about what happens next. We will... Are you planning to divorce me? I didn't answer immediately. Outside the window, the city lights flickered on across downtown Denver. I spoke to a lawyer, I said finally. He went quiet. So that's a yes, he said. It's a possibility. Brian sighed heavily. I didn't think things would go this far. That's because you never thought I would fight back. That's not fair, isn't it? You froze everything, he said. You trapped me in another country. You trapped yourself. He didn't respond. For several seconds, we simply listened to each other breathing. Then Brian asked something that sounded almost like a confession. When did you find out? The night before you booked the flight. Another long silence followed. You knew the whole time, he said slowly. Yes. And you never said anything? No. Why? I looked out at the glowing skyline one more time. Because I wanted you to believe everything was normal, I said. And then I wanted you to leave. Brian exhaled again. For the first time since the conversation began. He didn't argue, because he finally understood something important. The moment he boarded that plane, the story he had written for his future had already ended. Brian returned to Denver 3 days later. I knew the moment his plane landed because my phone vibrated with a short message. I'm back. Nothing more. No apology. No explanation. Just the quiet acknowledgement that the trip he thought would change his life had ended very differently than he imagined. I didn't respond. Instead, I finished the paperwork on my desk and walked out of the hospital into the cold evening air. The sky above Denver was already dark, the city lights reflecting off the glass towers downtown. Traffic moved steadily through the streets while people hurried home from work. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, except my marriage had quietly ended somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico. When I arrived at the apartment later that evening, the hallway outside was silent. Brian's car was parked in the garage. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the suitcase sitting near the living room wall. Brian stood near the kitchen counter, his jacket still on, staring down at his phone. He looked up when he heard the door close. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said the only thing he could think of. Hi. Hi. His appearance surprised me slightly. In just a few days, he looked older, more tired. The confident posture he always carried seemed to have disappeared somewhere along the trip. When did you get back? I asked. About an hour ago. Long flight. He nodded. Yeah. Another silence settled over the room. The apartment felt strangely unfamiliar with both of us standing there. Finally, Brian gestured toward the dining table. There's something you should see. I walked closer. A white envelope rested in the center of the table. He slid it toward me. What's this? I asked. I found it on the counter when I came in. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a stack of legal documents. Divorce filings. Financial protection orders. Formal notification of marital asset review. Rebecca had clearly moved faster than I expected. Brian watched me carefully while I read. So it's official now, he said quietly. For the moment, you planned this. Yes. He leaned against the chair across from me. You met with a lawyer before I even left. Yes. And you triggered the financial review while I was in the air. Yes. Brian let out a short laugh that carried no humor at all. I should have seen it coming. But you didn't. No. He sat down across from me, his shoulders slightly slumped. For years I thought I understood you, he said. Did you? I thought you were predictable. That word again. Predictable. Responsible. Quiet. The woman who managed the household while Brian chased bigger ambitions. And now, I asked, now I realize I had no idea who you really were. I folded the documents carefully and placed them back into the envelope. "What happened with Natalie?" I asked. Brian rubbed his forehead tiredly. "She went back to Denver yesterday. And she doesn't want to see me anymore." That didn't surprise me. "When did she find out the truth?" I asked. "About the marriage." "Yes. The night everything collapsed," he said. "The hotel situation?" He nodded slowly. "She thought I had lied to her." "You did?" "Yes." He didn't argue. For the first time in our entire relationship. Brian seemed completely out of defenses. "What happens now?" he asked. "The legal process continues. And the accounts, they remain under review." "For how long?" "Until the divorce proceedings begin." Brian looked down at the table. "So that's it?" "That's it." Another silence stretched across the room. Outside the apartment window, the lights of the city shimmered quietly against the dark sky. Brian finally spoke again. "You know what the worst part is?" "What?" "I thought I was in control of everything." His voice carried a strange mixture of regret and disbelief. "The trip," he continued. "The wedding. The timing. But you weren't." "No," he admitted. "You were." I stood up and walked toward the window. The city below moved with its usual rhythm. Cars passing through intersections. People crossing the streets. Life continuing without caring about the small disasters inside individual apartments. Behind me, Brian spoke again. "I never thought you'd go this far." I looked back at him. "You never thought I'd protect myself." He didn't respond. Because there was nothing left to say. The story he had planned for our future had already ended. And now he was finally beginning to understand that every decision he made had led him directly to this moment. A week after Brian returned from Mexico, the apartment finally felt quiet again. Not the tense silence that had filled the rooms when we first stood across from each other with divorce papers between us, but a calmer kind of quiet. The kind that comes when a decision has already been made and there's nothing left to argue about. Brian had moved most of his belongings out 2 days earlier. The suitcase that once sat by the living room wall was gone. His jackets were no longer hanging near the door. Even the engineering books that used to clutter the shelves had disappeared. Only a few empty spaces remained. Quiet reminders that someone had once lived here with me. I stood by the window that Sunday morning with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the Denver skyline slowly wake up beneath a pale winter sky. For months my life had been quietly unraveling behind a curtain of normal routines. Now everything felt strangely clear. My phone buzzed softly on the kitchen counter. A message from Rebecca. "The financial review will remain active until the divorce hearing begins. You're fully protected." I typed a short reply. "Thank you for everything." Then I placed the phone down again and returned to the window. A few minutes later there was a knock at the door. Not loud. Just 2 quiet taps. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Brian stood in the hallway holding a small cardboard box. He looked slightly uncomfortable, like someone who wasn't sure if they were still welcome in a place that used to belong to them. "I forgot a few things," he said. I stepped aside to let him in. He walked slowly toward the kitchen counter and set the box down. Inside were a few random items. A watch he had left in the bathroom, a folder with some old tax documents, and a framed photograph from our wedding day. He picked up the frame and studied it quietly. The picture showed 2 people standing under warm summer sunlight, smiling like they believed the future was simple. Brian ran a hand through his hair. "I remember this day," he said. "So do I." We looked happy. He nodded slowly. For a moment it felt like we were looking at strangers. 2 younger versions of ourselves who had no idea what their future would eventually become. Brian placed the photograph back in the box. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he said. "I'm sure you have." "I know saying sorry won't fix it." "No," I said calmly. "It won't." Another silence settled between us. This one wasn't tense. It was simply the quiet space between 2 people who had finally reached the end of something. Brian looked around the apartment one more time. "You're staying here?" "Yes," he nodded. "I'll be moving to a smaller place across town." "That sounds reasonable. I guess we'll see each other again during the court process." Probably. He hesitated for a moment, then said something quietly. You handled all of this differently than I expected. How so? I thought you would scream, he said, or throw things, or try to stop me. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Would that have changed anything? He thought about it for a moment. No, I repeated. Brian picked up the box and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped and turned back once more. I underestimated you, he said. Yes, I replied. I won't make that mistake again. That's good. Then he stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. The apartment fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt peaceful. I walked back to the window and looked out across the city. Cars moved slowly through the streets below. People walked along the sidewalks carrying groceries and coffee cups. Life continuing the way it always does. For months I had believed my life was collapsing. But the truth was simpler than that. It wasn't collapsing. It was changing. Brian had thought revenge would mean screaming, fighting, and chaos. But sometimes the strongest response to betrayal isn't anger. Sometimes it's control. Sometimes it's patience. And sometimes it's simply refusing to let someone walk away with the life you helped build. I took a slow sip of coffee and watched the morning light spread across the city. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt open. And if you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have confronted him immediately? Or would you have waited like I did? Tell me in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, hidden strength, and the quiet kind of revenge that changes everything, make sure you stay here with us and subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the calmest people have the most powerful stories to tell. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.